Samuel Adetola was the epitome of success. Born into a modest family, he had worked tirelessly to rise above his humble beginnings. By the time he turned 45, he was one of the wealthiest men in his region, owning estates, businesses, and properties that spoke of his relentless drive and ambition. His name carried weight in business circles, and his wealth was the envy of many. Yet Samuel's heart was far from at peace. Though he had everything money could buy, he lacked one thing he desired more than anything else: a male heir. His two wives, Adebisi and Ronke, had blessed him with 7 daughters. While he loved his daughters dearly, the societal and familial pressure to have a male child weighed heavily on him. His mother, Mama Aid, was his loudest critic, constantly reminding him of his failure to secure his lineage. "Samuel, my son," Mama Aid often began during their long family meetings, "you have houses, businesses, and land, but who will inherit it when you are gone? These daughters of yours will marry and carry another man's name. What legacy will you leave behind?" Samuel would groan inwardly whenever these conversations came up. He had tried to reason with his mother in the past, explaining that his daughters were capable and could inherit his wealth. But her response was always the same: "A daughter can inherit nothing in this family. Our tradition is clear: a man's wealth must pass to his son." The pressure intensified after Samuel's younger brother Kunle welcomed his second son. The family began to whisper that Kunle would inherit Samuel's fortune if he failed to produce a male heir. The thought was unbearable. Samuel felt trapped. His achievements, which once filled him with pride, now felt meaningless without a son to carry on his name. One evening, as Samuel sat in his study with a glass of whiskey, his mother stormed in uninvited. "Samuel, enough is enough," she declared. "Mother, please, not tonight," Samuel said, rubbing his temples. "No, we will talk about it tonight," Mama Aid insisted. "You are not getting younger. You need to marry a third wife. Someone who can give you what Adebisi and Ronke have failed to give you." Samuel sighed deeply. "Mother, I can't just go around marrying women as if they're lottery tickets." "This is not about luck," she shot back. "This is about finding the right woman. A woman from a family where sons are plentiful. Let me handle it. I will find her for you." Samuel hesitated, but the weight of his mother's words combined with his own fears finally broke him. "Fine," he muttered. "Do whatever you want." Ronke, his second wife, had been eavesdropping on the conversation from behind the partially closed door. Her heart sank as she processed the news. Samuel was going to marry a third wife, a woman who could give him the male heir he so desperately wanted, and that would threaten Ronke's place in the household. The thought of losing Samuel to another woman gnawed at her, stirring something dark inside her. That night, as she lay in bed, the weight of her emotions seemed unbearable. She couldn't let this happen. She had to do something. She quietly got out of bed, not wanting to wake Samuel, and sent a message to her best friend, Titi. Titi, always the more mischievous and daring one, quickly arrived at Ronke's house, her eyes wide with urgency. "What is it, Ronke?" Titi asked, seeing the frantic look in her friend's eyes. "I overheard Samuel and Mama Aid talking," Ronke whispered, her voice trembling. "He's marrying a third wife. He's going to get a son with her, and that means my daughters and I won't have anything." Titi's eyes flickered with understanding. "You can't let that happen, can you?" "I can't," Ronke replied, shaking her head. "I can't lose everything I've worked for. I've been a good wife to him, and now he wants to cast us aside." "I know someone who can help," Titi said, her voice low but filled with conviction. "A witch doctor. I've heard stories about him. He has the power to make things right. But it won't be easy." Ronke stared at her friend, uncertainty clouding her thoughts. "A witch doctor? What do you mean?" "He can make you pregnant with a male child, but you must do exactly as he says," Titi explained. "It will require you to make a sacrifice, but it could be the only way to ensure that Samuel's legacy stays with you and your children." The idea of resorting to dark magic terrified Ronke. She had always been a devout woman, but the thought of losing Samuel and all that she had worked for pushed her to the brink. She was desperate. "Fine," Ronke said, her voice shaky but determined. "I'll do whatever it takes." The following night, Titi took Ronke to the witch doctor's home, a secluded hut deep in the forest. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, and strange symbols adorned the walls. The witch doctor, an old man with sharp, penetrating eyes, greeted them silently. "Do you understand the cost of what you ask?" the witch doctor asked, his voice gravelly. "I do," Ronke replied, her heart pounding in her chest. "Very well," the witch doctor said. "You must sleep in a room alone tonight. A spirit will come to you in the form of your husband, and you must allow it to fulfill its purpose. After that, you will conceive a male child." Ronke recoiled slightly, her stomach turning at the thought of a spirit having intercourse with her. She had heard such stories but never thought she would be part of one. But the fear of losing Samuel and the prospect of never having a male heir pushed all rational thought from her mind. "I will do it," she whispered. The witch doctor handed her a small carved charm. "Call your husband's name 3 times while holding this charm with you alone in a room, and the spirit will come to you." That night, Ronke followed the witch doctor's instructions. She lay alone in a room, trembling with both fear and anticipation. As the night deepened, the room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. Suddenly, she brought out the charm and called her husband's name 3 times as she was instructed, and she immediately felt a presence, a weight in the air. The figure of her husband Samuel appeared before her, though his features were blurred and indistinct, as though the very air around him bent in strange ways. Ronke's breath caught in her throat, but the charm around her neck pulsed with warmth, giving her the courage to remain still. Samuel, or the spirit in his form, approached her, and though she wanted to scream, the words stuck in her throat. The spirit gently caressed her, and despite the unnatural sensation, Ronke felt an overwhelming sense of power and urgency in the air. The act was quick, and once it was over, the spirit disappeared as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving Ronke breathless and shaking. The next few days felt like an eternity for Ronke. She kept to herself, afraid to speak of the night's events to anyone. But then, as her body began to change, it became undeniable. She was pregnant. A visit to the clinic confirmed it. An ultrasound showed that she was carrying a boy. Ronke couldn't believe it. The witch doctor's magic had worked. She was going to give Samuel the male heir he had always wanted. But even as she rejoiced, a cold feeling settled in her stomach. She had done something unnatural, and while she would not acknowledge it openly, part of her feared what the consequences might be. Would Samuel be grateful, or would the weight of her actions destroy everything? When Samuel found out that Ronke was pregnant with a son, he was overjoyed. Finally, after all these years, the heir he had longed for was on the way. "A son," he whispered as he embraced her, his joy evident. "I knew we would have a boy. I knew you would make me proud, my darling wife." Overjoyed, Ronke had been holding her breath, waiting for the right moment to speak up. The relief of finally having secured the heir she so desperately wanted gave her the courage she needed. She looked at Samuel, her voice shaky yet firm. "But I overheard you and your mother trying to replace me with a new wife," Ronke said, her eyes not meeting his. Samuel froze for a moment, as if the air had thickened with the weight of her words. His expression softened immediately, and he stepped back, gently holding her arms. "Ronke, please," he said, his voice full of sincerity. "I would never replace you. I promise, there's no need for a third wife anymore. You've given me everything I wanted, my son. And I swear I will do anything to make you happy." Ronke's heart ached at his words, but the lingering sting of betrayal was not easily washed away. Yet looking at him now, with the joy in his eyes, she felt a strange peace beginning to settle in her chest. Perhaps, just perhaps, the magic had worked. Not just in bringing her son into the world, but in mending the cracks in their marriage. Samuel called his mother to deliver the news of the pregnancy. When he told her that Ronke was carrying a son, Mama Aid could hardly contain her excitement. "A son," she gasped, clasping her hands together. "Finally, Samuel, you have secured your legacy. My grandson, the one who will inherit everything you've worked for." She beamed at Ronke, who remained quiet, choosing to say nothing about the strange way in which this child had come to be. For now, she was willing to let go of the guilt and the doubts that had plagued her heart. After all, this was what they had all wanted. As the weeks passed, the anticipation of the baby's arrival grew. Ronke's pregnancy was uneventful, though Samuel couldn't help but worry about the strange incidents that occurred in their home. There were odd whispers late at night, and sometimes things would go missing only to reappear days later in strange places. Samuel brushed it off as the stress of the pregnancy, but Ronke knew something wasn't quite right. Still, she kept her silence. What had been done could not be undone. The day finally arrived. Ronke went into labor, and the excitement in the household was palpable. Samuel, Mama Ade, and the entire household rushed to the hospital, eager to meet the child who would carry Samuel's name and legacy. But just as they were arriving at the hospital, a strange thing happened. The power in the entire hospital went out. Lights flickered and then went out completely, casting everything in darkness. It was an eerie moment, one that everyone in the hospital couldn't explain, as the emergency backup generators took longer than usual to kick in. But no one paid much attention. They were too focused on the impending arrival of the baby, and the excitement of a long-awaited heir overshadowed any unsettling feelings. Nurses and doctors rushed to Ronke's side, moving swiftly to prepare for the delivery. The lights were back on, and the hospital resumed its usual hum of activity. Ronke's labor was long and painful, but in the end, a healthy baby boy was born. Samuel's heart swelled with pride as he held his son in his arms for the first time. "Daniel," he whispered, looking down at the baby with tears in his eyes. "Welcome, my son." Mama Ade wept with joy beside him, clutching her new grandson tightly. "Finally, Samuel, the legacy continues." But Ronke, exhausted and still recovering from the birth, couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The strange power outage, the odd sensations she'd felt during her pregnancy, and the unsettling whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere. She wondered if they were connected. Was it possible that the spirit that had come to her was not only part of her son's birth, but somehow still present, watching over them? Later that night, as she lay in her hospital bed, Ronke couldn't sleep. She had hoped the birth would bring peace, but instead it felt as though an unseen force was hovering over them. The baby was calm in his crib beside her, but she couldn't quiet the unease that had settled deep within her. As Samuel and his mother celebrated with friends and family, Ronke remained in her room, her eyes fixed on her son. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest since the night of his birth. The room felt strangely still, and despite the joy outside, Ronke could not shake the lingering sense of dread. Shortly after, Samuel's phone rang. He looked at the screen, and the warmth on his face instantly faded. His expression tightened as he answered the call. "What?" "I am coming," he said sharply, his voice laced with panic. Without another word, he quickly turned to Ronke, his face clouded with urgency. "I have to go," he explained, his voice rushed. "3 of my shops have been closed down by government agencies. They claim there were illegal activities happening, but I have no idea what they're talking about. I need to go sort this out immediately." He rushed out of the room, leaving Ronke with a sinking feeling in her heart. She could hear the faint sounds of the ongoing celebration in the distance, but they felt hollow to her now. The joy of her son's birth seemed to be overshadowed by the storm of uncertainty brewing in the family's life. As Samuel left in a hurry, Ronke sat still for a moment, staring at Daniel in his crib. Her mind churned with thoughts of the strange occurrences since the birth. The power outage at the hospital, the unsettling whispers, and now this sudden wave of misfortune striking Samuel's businesses. It wasn't normal, and Ronke couldn't help but feel that her son's birth was somehow tied to it all. In the weeks that followed, the misfortune seemed to escalate. Samuel, once a prosperous and successful man, watched helplessly as disaster after disaster struck. First, 2 of his warehouses mysteriously burned down in the dead of night. The fire spread quickly, leaving behind nothing but charred remains and smoldering ashes. Then, nearly 30,000 birds, part of his thriving poultry business, fell victim to a mysterious illness that spread rapidly through the flock. Despite all attempts to save them, they perished within days, devastating his livelihood. As if that wasn't enough, Samuel's dogs, which had been his pride and joy, were found brutally devoured by an alligator that seemingly appeared out of nowhere, making its way through the high walls of his compound. It was the strangest thing. Alligator sightings were unheard of in the area, let alone one powerful enough to break through fences and prey on dogs. Samuel was beside himself. Every business venture he had worked so tirelessly to build was crumbling before his eyes. He called his partners, his advisors, and anyone who might have a solution, but nothing seemed to work. The losses mounted, and the attacks on his properties and assets grew increasingly bizarre. But despite everything, Samuel remained blind to the possibility that the one thing that had changed in his life, the birth of his son, could have any connection to the bad luck that was now following him. He poured his frustration into trying to salvage his businesses, but the string of misfortune never stopped. He hired new security for his properties, but nothing stopped the fires. He sought doctors to investigate the bird deaths, but there was no explanation. And the alligator, he couldn't even begin to make sense of that. Ronke, on the other hand, knew deep down that something was wrong. She couldn't escape the chilling thought that her son, Daniel, might be at the center of it all. Her heart ached as she saw Samuel's confusion, and though she didn't dare speak it aloud, she wondered if the spirit that had come to her was not just a force of power, but a force of destruction. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, with no sign of relief. Samuel's demeanor shifted from frustration to despair. His once joyful face was now often clouded with worry. He had no answers, and the strange occurrences only seemed to escalate. But his mother, on the other hand, had noticed the pattern. She observed the decline in Samuel's fortune, the worsening of his health, and the mounting disasters that had plagued their family ever since Ronke became pregnant with Daniel. It didn't take long for Mama Ad to trace it back to that moment, the moment when Ronke, her second wife, had given birth to Samuel's only son. It was clear to her that something had shifted in the family ever since that day. She watched as things got worse, the businesses faltering, the warehouses burning, the birds dying, and the wild alligator that mysteriously appeared on their property. The more Mama Ad observed, the more she became convinced that the cause of their troubles lay within Ronke's pregnancy, and in the child she had born. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Mama Ad sought answers. She reached out to a spiritualist, someone reputed to have deep knowledge of the unseen world. The spiritualist listened to her story with rapt attention, nodding thoughtfully. After a long pause, he spoke in a low, hushed tone. "The child born to your son's second wife. He is not just a boy. He is the seed of evil, and he carries misfortune everywhere he goes. There is a curse attached to him. The woman you call your daughter-in-law knows more than she lets on. She is involved in something that has unleashed this chaos upon your family." Mama Ad's heart sank as the spiritualist's words echoed in her mind. She felt a cold shiver run through her body, but she refused to let it show. She had to protect her son, her legacy, and the future of their family. With this new knowledge, she returned home with a heavy heart, knowing that she had to warn Samuel before it was too late. The next day, as Samuel sat in his office, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion, his mother approached him cautiously, her face etched with concern. "Samuel," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I need to speak with you. There's something you need to know about Ronke, about the child she has born." Samuel's head snapped up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Mother, what are you talking about again?" But Mama Ad persisted, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "I've seen it, Samuel. Everything that's happening to you, to our family, it's because of your second wife. She knows something about this. She's hiding the truth from you." Samuel's eyes darkened. "What truth, Mother? Ronke is the mother of my son. She's done nothing but try to give us what we wanted, a son. I don't want to hear this nonsense." Mama Ad placed a hand on his arm, her voice pleading. "I went to a spiritualist. He told me that Ronke is involved in something that has cursed this family. I don't know what it is, but I feel it in my bones. You need to be careful. I'm afraid for you, Samuel." Samuel jerked his arm away from her grip, his anger flaring. "Enough, Mother. You're upsetting me. Don't you dare speak ill of Ronke. I don't want to hear it anymore." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You've always had issues with her, and now you're blaming her for everything that's gone wrong in my life." Mama Ad stepped back, her heart aching at his words. She had never seen him like this. Her son, once so confident and strong, had become a shell of himself, consumed by the chaos around him. And she feared that he was too blind to see the danger that was closing in on them. "I'm not blaming her, Samuel," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm trying to protect you, protect your legacy. Please listen to me. There is something wrong, and we need to find out what it is." But Samuel, already agitated, waved her off. "I don't want to hear it. I will not let you tear my family apart. I love Ronke and my son. If there's something you need to deal with, it's your own fear, not mine. I don't want you causing problems in my household." Mama Aid's heart broke at his words. He had always been so stubborn, so quick to dismiss her wisdom. But this time, she knew she couldn't give up. She had seen the signs, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was lurking in the shadows, threatening to tear her family apart. "I only want the best for you, Samuel," she said quietly, her voice tinged with sadness. "Please, do not ignore the warning signs." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Samuel to stew in his own confusion and frustration. As days passed, the misfortunes continued to escalate. Samuel's temper grew shorter, and his frustration turned to desperation. He tried everything he could think of to reverse the damage, but nothing seemed to work. The more he tried to fix things, the worse they became. Ronke, too, noticed the strain between her husband and his mother. Samuel had grown distant, and she could feel the tension in their home. Despite her own growing suspicions about Daniel's strange connection to the chaos, she kept quiet, afraid of what the truth might mean. What if somehow she was to blame? What if her son's birth had truly unleashed something dangerous? She couldn't bring herself to confess to Samuel, but deep down she felt an unshakable unease that haunted her every waking moment. Was her son truly the source of their family's downfall? Or was there something darker at play, something she had yet to fully understand? On Daniel's 4th birthday, Samuel, eager to celebrate his son's special day, organized a grand party and invited family and friends. The atmosphere was lively, filled with laughter and chatter as guests mingled, enjoying the festivities. However, amidst the joy, Daniel seemed oddly quiet, sitting at a corner of the room, observing everyone as if lost in thought. Without saying a single word, Daniel slowly stood up, his small hands twitching with a peculiar determination. He slipped away from the crowd unnoticed, his innocent face betraying none of the malevolent energy that seemed to radiate from him. He made his way to the kitchen, where a small bottle of lighter fuel caught his eye. With eerie precision, he poured it onto the floor, then picked up a lighter and flicked it on. A flame burst to life, and before anyone could notice, Daniel set the house alight from behind. The fire spread quickly. At first, it was barely a whisper, but soon it engulfed the entire house in a massive wave of flames. People screamed, panic filling the air as they rushed to evacuate. The scene quickly descended into chaos, with guests frantically running to find water to put out the fire, while others were frozen in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. Outside, people stood at a safe distance, helplessly watching the inferno. The heat from the fire could be felt even from far away, and the entire house soon appeared to be lost. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest as he searched the crowd for his wife and son, his mind racing with disbelief. But then, amidst the chaos, Samuel's mother noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her eyes fell on Daniel, who was standing eerily still, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Samuel, look!" she cried, her voice trembling. Samuel turned toward his mother, his eyes following her gaze. What he saw made his stomach drop. There was Daniel, standing near the flames, his eyes wide with a twisted sort of glee. The boy was watching the house burn down, not with fear, not with concern, but with excitement. A sinister smile played on his lips as he watched the destruction unfold. And then, as they stared in horror, Samuel's heart nearly stopped. It was impossible, but it was there. Just barely visible, transparent horns like those of a sheep protruding from Daniel's head. A long, thin tail flicked behind him as he stood there, his small body radiating an unnatural heat. Samuel's vision blurred and his legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed to the ground in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. This was the moment he realized the truth that his mother had tried to warn him about. The truth that his own son was no ordinary child. Everyone shifted away from Daniel as he stood excitedly gazing at the blazing house. Only Ronke remained. She rushed to her son, her arms instinctively reaching out to embrace him, to shield him from whatever darkness was consuming him. But as she touched his skin, a sharp gasp escaped her lips. His body was abnormally hot, like fire itself had taken hold of him. His eyes, though still wide with excitement, seemed to glow with an eerie light. Ronke froze in horror. The heat emanating from Daniel was unlike anything she had ever felt. In that moment, she knew that something inside her son had gone far beyond what she had ever imagined. All eyes were now on them, Samuel still lying on the ground in stunned disbelief, Ronke holding onto her son but unsure of what to do, and Daniel, who stood like a strange, malevolent figure amidst the flames. The fire continued to rage behind them, but it was as if it was no longer the main concern. The crowd was silent, the shock of the moment holding everyone in a trance. They had witnessed the unimaginable, the birth of a dark force they couldn't understand. And now, as the flames continued to devour the house in the background, they all stood there, paralyzed by the horrifying truth that had come to light.